You returned home with your newborn son wrapped in a hospital blanket that still carried the scent of iodine and quiet promises. The lights flickered once as you stepped across the threshold of your penthouse, like the walls themselves braced for what they knew had been set in motion. You thought the silence was the peace you had earned, until you saw the note resting inside the crib. Your breath froze before your body did, because the paper wasn't one you had written or seen before. Crisp, white, uncreased, folded once with deliberate care. You picked it up slowly, as if your fingers already knew it was something more than ink. They thought your absence had made you soft. 9 months out of the boardroom, 9 months without retaliation, 9 months to become a myth. But your silence hadn't been surrender. It had been calculation. And now the warning in your hand changed the velocity of everything. Call police. Do not stay here. 4 words written in a rushed, angular scrawl. No signature, no explanation, just a burning match pressed into your memory. You turned instinctively toward the baby, now sleeping again, his breaths too shallow to echo. You didn't scream. You didn't panic. You picked up the phone. The signal came through before the first ring ended. Not a voice. Not static. A redirect. You were sent somewhere you hadn't called, someone you hadn't reached for in years. A protocol buried so deep it had only one use. Hostile reconnection. The voice that picked up was calm. Female. Not surprised. We wondered when you'd come home. You said nothing. Your eyes moved back to the note, then to the crib, then to the hallway behind you. Something moved. You moved faster. By the time the police arrived, the hallway camera had gone black. Your elevator logs had been wiped. No sign of a forced entry. No fingerprints but your own. But the officers didn't question your story. Because when one of them read the note, his face dropped like a curtain, and he called for backup before even speaking to you again. You watched his lips as he read the words again. Watched him go, pale like a man reading the last page of a story that involved his own name. He folded the note carefully, like evidence, like testimony, and asked you one question you didn't answer. When did you last speak with Byron Keel? You hadn't said his name in 14 months. Not since he handed you the glass of champagne, the day after the merger, and said the words you'd never forget. Now disappear, for all our sakes. You remembered everything. The boardroom applause. The way the lights dimmed just as the ink dried on the paper that made him CEO. You walked away without resistance, but they never saw the storm you stored behind your silence. They mistook your exit for defeat. You had watched them gut your legacy, piece by piece, watched from 100 firewalled feeds behind a dozen mirrored identities. You knew every passcode, every burner channel, every insider leak. You had watched Byron Keel rewrite your contracts, terminate your analysts, and bury your name in 3 corporate shells. You hadn't spoken his name. But he had whispered yours. Once. On a live mic he didn't know was active. You knew. And you waited. The baby stirred. The officer snapped out of his trance, waved 2 others toward the bedroom, and you realized the threat wasn't abstract. You had always assumed they'd move against your accounts, your leverage, maybe your offshore assets. But this wasn't about finance. This was personal. They thought you had died in spirit the day you signed away your voting shares. They toasted your downfall and left the bottle corked in your old office. But you hadn't died. You had evolved. The night nurse you had hired was gone. Vanished without a trace, though you found her watch still ticking on the counter. Someone had been in the house. Someone with clearance. One officer pulled you aside and asked if you had any enemies. You smiled. They wouldn't call themselves that. But they should start. The signal came through again. This time, it was a file, an audio file, time-stamped 4 days ago, sent from a secure device linked to a ghost asset within Keel's security perimeter. You didn't press play. Not yet. You closed your eyes and remembered the last time someone tried to erase you. It ended with a suicide and a non-disclosure agreement no one dared leak. You handed your son to the attending officer with hands that didn't shake. You picked up your coat, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the sub-basement button. Not to flee, but to return. Back to the architecture you built, beneath the floor plans Keel had never known existed. Because you remembered what they all forgot. The foundation still belonged to you. And somewhere below the skyline, a storm waited. In silence, the elevator doors hissed open into the dark, unfinished sub-basement, an echo chamber of concrete, steel, and secrets. You stepped out slowly, your breath catching in the stale air that hadn't moved since you were last here. Your eyes adjusted, tracing the outline of the hidden terminal embedded in the wall behind a false panel of rusted pipes. They thought you'd never return. They thought motherhood had broken your spine, had pulled you out of the game and locked you into domestic silence. But you knew the truth. Giving birth had sharpened every blade inside you. You activated the terminal with a retinal scan no one else remembered existed. The green flash blinked once, then flooded the room with flickering light. The walls hummed alive. 3 screens sliding open from stone, bearing the digital skeleton of the merger contract Byron Keel had shoved under your nose all those months ago. It was time to look at it again. Page 67, Clause 45.9. You hovered over the highlighted line, the one your legal team flagged, redacted, then dismissed as boilerplate language. But you had buried a trigger phrase inside that clause 2 years before the merger. And now the system decrypted it. If Executive Party A is incapacitated or absent for more than 180 days, all proxy rights revert to founder. They didn't know that in your disappearance, they'd reactivated your power. Byron had signed it himself, eager to push through the deal. You watched the footage of him laughing in that meeting, lifting a glass of mid-century scotch with his hand wrapped around your future like a vice. You downloaded the clause, embedded it in a clean ledger, and watched as the founder override, keys synced with your dormant access codes. They had signed your resurrection. You knew they wouldn't see it coming, not even when it hit the front page. Because they'd grown fat off arrogance, bloated on short-term wins and mutual betrayals. They had forgotten you built the original encryption language that still pulsed beneath the company's operating core. And now it was breathing again. The audio file still burned in your pocket. You played it now. And the voice crackled through the silence. Keel thinks she's gone for good. Idiot doesn't know she owns the backdoor lock to the Cobalt Fund. The Cobalt Fund. The hidden war chest. The one Byron pretended didn't exist when they asked how he acquired the lithium mines in Bolivia and the underwater data rights off Nova Scotia. That account had been under ghost encryption for 5 years. And you held the key. It was never about exile. It was about timing. They had betrayed you with your own design. You scanned the merger papers line by line, searching for fingerprints, not literal, but behavioral. Byron's cadence, his speech patterns, the way he always overused legal redundancies when he was hiding something. Then you saw it. A digital signature buried inside a clause that had nothing to do with finance. Memorandum insert approved by L.M. Sorensen. Sorensen, your former chief strategy officer, your closest advisor, your confidant through 3 acquisition wars and a near bankruptcy. She was the one who told you to sign the merger in the first place. Said it was the only path forward. Said Byron could be managed. You remembered the night she came to your apartment with that bottle of red. and how she cried when you told her you were pregnant. She said she'd keep everything running while you stepped away. She said, "I've got you." But she'd sold you out before your first trimester ended. They toasted your downfall on a rooftop in Shanghai the same night. Your son's heartbeat appeared on the monitor. You clicked deeper. Her name wasn't just on the contract. It was on the payout schedule. L.M. Sorensen had received a bonus 2 weeks after the merger closed. A payout that tripled her equity and quietly transferred ownership of your predictive analytics division to an offshore shell owned by Byron's cousin. The betrayal had always been personal. They didn't just want your company. They wanted your legacy incinerated. You leaned back in the steel chair, watching the data flow like blood. Your jaw tightened. Not with rage, but with clarity. You knew now exactly how far they'd gone to erase you, and that meant you also knew how far you could go to end them. Your fingers tapped out an old sequence on the console, one used only once before. It pinged 3 remote assets, one of which had been dormant for years. It was time to resurrect the ghost identity. The one no one remembered. The one even Sorensen thought had died during the Aragon raid in Morocco. You watched the name light up in the terminal, K. Astra, and with it, the old network came alive, encrypted channels reconnected, surveillance nodes pinged to life. Even the offshore vaults trembled back into existence, blooming with accounts you'd left untouched for this exact moment. They thought they buried you, but you had planted roots. And now they would find themselves choking on your return. One last file blinked into view, a private calendar invite, sent from Sorensen's account, scheduled for tomorrow, a closed-door meeting titled Audit Preparation, Internal Risk Discussion. Location, Boardroom 17B. Time, 10:01 a.m. That was when they'd try to erase the trail. That was when they'd purge every trace of what they'd done to you. But you would be there first. You stood in the sub-basement, eyes narrowed, heart steady. The betrayal had finally bloomed. Now came the retribution. And above your head, far above the bedrock and wire, the skyscraper whispered your name through its steel veins. You were no longer gone. You were gathering. The city skyline glared like a lie. Glass towers smirking under a blood-orange sky, oblivious to the vengeance coursing beneath their foundations. You stepped into your car before dawn, the tinted windows already logged into a system that hadn't recognized your clearance in months. But the ignition obeyed you like it remembered. They thought your face had faded from the recognition grid. They thought your silence was a surrender to the machine. But you knew the machine because you built it, and it still bent toward your will when spoken to in the right code. The vehicle drifted through pre-rush silence, past gates that opened without query. The security drone at level 9 hesitated for a fraction of a second, then retracted its scan beam and waved you through. In the rearview mirror, the infant carrier sat empty. Your son was safe now, held tight in the custody of people even Byron Keel couldn't bribe. But that wasn't what slowed your breathing. It was the second signal. It came through at 6:14 a.m., a scrambled feed, resolution low, time stamped, labeled, only with 3 characters. SR7. Your hand trembled, not with fear, but with awe. SR7 was the surveillance relay you thought had been destroyed in the Aragon asset strike, the one housed in an illegal node buried beneath Sector Red. It had only one purpose: to auto-activate upon detection of a keyword sequence in a secure zone, and the keyword was spoken last night. By Byron Keel. You played the file. He was in his office, jacket off, tie loosened, drink in hand. The lighting was dim, but the shadows were clear. You saw Sorensen at the edge of the frame, seated, arms crossed. Byron was pacing. "She'll show up at the audit," he said, voice slurred slightly. "I know it. She's not stupid. She's strategic. Always was." Sorensen laughed, a hollow bark. "And if she does?" "We frame her," Byron said, swallowing the last of his whiskey. "Leak that she embezzled from the Cobalt Fund. She can't prove otherwise." You paused the feed. Heart still. Mouth dry. They were going to turn the war chest into your coffin. They thought if you reached for what was yours, they could paint it as theft. They thought you'd been gone long enough that public memory would side with them. But they forgot something. The internal audit didn't just review financials. It logged access points, metadata, device IDs. The second they moved those funds, it would stamp their fingerprints, and yours? Yours were never on it. You hit play again. "She left willingly," Sorensen said. "We made her an offer. She took it." Byron chuckled. "She was pregnant and terrified. I watched her break in real time. They toasted then. 2 glasses. The same sound they made when they celebrated your erasure. The same sound you'd embedded in the file that would soon be their undoing. You froze the image, their glasses mid-air." Sorensen's smirk suspended. Byron's eyes half-closed in arrogance. "You'd record this still, printed in grayscale, frame it with a headline, release it under the ghost identity when the audit climaxed." Your car pulled into the underground executive entrance. You passed empty elevators and echoing corridors until you reached Terminal 17, the back door to 17B. You hadn't been in this room since the day they pushed you out. But now it would be your stage. You activated the relay port behind the painting of the founding partners. The room's temperature dropped. The lights hummed louder. The surveillance system blinked green. You plugged in your drive. The screen flooded with data. Not just logs and metadata, but emails, voice memos, financial transfers routed through Gibraltar, Zurich, and Lagos. Every keystroke Sorensen made, every bribe Kiel accepted, every silence they bought. You watched it in real time. A decade of betrayals resurfacing like corpses breaking the tide. Then, the system offered you a prompt. Leak 2. You didn't hesitate. You typed in the target drop. Glass Harbor.io, a whistleblower node you'd seeded years ago under an environmental shell corp. They thought it was defunct. But the moment your files reached it, the dominoes would begin to fall. One country, one corporation at a time. You hit send. The file compressed, encrypted, launched. And just like that, their firewall fell to its knees. You stared at the screen, where the analytics began to climb. Downloads pinging across the globe. Singapore, Prague, Santiago. The leak was live, irreversible. You stepped away as the boardroom lights flickered, like they knew what was coming. Your phone vibrated in your pocket. A single message from an unlisted number. Just 5 words. "We saw. They're finished." You didn't smile. You didn't gloat. You turned and walked back through the corridor, past the portraits of men who had once called you child, girl, outsider. And as you reached the elevator, the ground beneath your feet seemed to shift. Not from movement, from power. It was returning to you. But this time, you wouldn't share it. You pressed the button for the top floor, the CEO wing, and prepared for the next move. The audit would begin in less than 2 hours. And when they stepped into that room, they would think they were in control. But you had already rewritten the ending. They toasted your silence once. Now they'd hear it echo. The boardroom clock clicked its slow, fatal rhythm. each tick another nail in the coffin they built for you with your own stolen blueprints. You stood in the shadows behind the smoked glass partition of 17B, the secondary conference room they never used unless something illicit required discretion. It was always their confession box. They thought you'd never come back to this floor. They thought your access had been wiped, your name scrubbed from the logs, your fingerprint unregistered. But the system never forgot the architect of its bones. They entered 2 by 2. Byron first, looking drawn, arrogant, an aging wolf in a $1,000 skin. Sorensen followed, lacquered calm masking the steel coil of nerves in her shoulders. Behind them, legal counsel, risk management, and 3 board members who had either betrayed you or profited from those who did. The lights didn't flicker this time. They blazed, full exposure, clinical brightness, no shadows left to hide in. They opened the audit with numbers, safe terrain, projected gains, offshore holdings, the false stability of spreadsheets. Byron spoke with precision, rehearsed for this moment, his voice coated in that grating charm he wore like cologne. But as he reached slide 6, a delay struck the main screen, a brief static pulse. Then the projector blinked. File override. You stepped from the shadows as the leak played behind them. Your footage, your edits, your evidence, the still frame of Byron and Sorensen toasting your erasure. The line from the audio, looping once for clarity. She was pregnant and terrified. I watched her break in real time. The silence in the room cracked like ice beneath weight. You walked calmly to the table and placed the printed merger clause down before Byron, your fingers gloved, movements exact. No tremble, no hesitation. You signed it, you said. His jaw locked. Sorensen stood too fast, knocking her glass off the table. It shattered, spilling water across the polished wood like a second truth. You turned to the board. You were told. I left willingly. You were told the fund was clean. You were told Byron Keel earned the chair by merit. You handed the forensic report to the risk manager. Evidence of the offshore laundering, the shell corporations, the digital routing that traced every embezzled dollar back to Byron's private estate in the Aegean. The manager's face went slack. She began to scan faster. Her lips moved in disbelief. I embedded an auto-trigger in the merger, you continued. Clause 4.5.9. With today's audit, I've legally reactivated all founder privileges. You paused. Let that settle. I own 82% of all voting rights. Effective this moment. Sorensen tried to speak, but her voice cracked. You silenced her with a glance. You won't be speaking at the next meeting. Byron's chair creaked as he leaned back, blood draining from his face. For a moment he seemed to shrink, his reputation folding inward like dying architecture. The signal came through again. A call routed to the boardroom terminal. You pressed accept. The face of your former ethics officer filled the screen. A man who had vanished just after your departure, rumored to have taken a consultancy in Dubai. He looked directly at Byron,